It's a great pleasure to be here. I think I've got about 15 minutes to start off before Richard takes over. Yeah. Maybe 10. Maybe okay. 10. Yeah, there is a growing recognition that democracy is in trouble and even in crisis. With the exception of a few dissenters, that view, I think, is shared by all the main institutions that measure and rank the world's democracies. That's my own institution, the Economist Intelligence Unit, Freedom House, the Bertelsmann Foundation, and Polity. A democracy scholar from America, Larry Diamond, says that we've been living through a mild democracy recession since 2006. So, just to put what's happening now in some perspective, the pace of global democratization accelerated after the start of what Samuel Huntington called the third wave in 1974, and it accelerated after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. During the 1970s and 1980s, more than 30 countries shifted from authoritarian to democratic political systems. And in the 1990s, the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe led to the proliferation of independent states and new democracies across the Eastern Bloc. A democratic transition also got underway in the 1990s in sub-Saharan Africa and continued in Latin America. In recent years, however, this wave of democratization has slowed, or in the case of some countries, it's been reversed, and we've had regressions. So today there is, I think, a widespread perception of democracy being in crisis, and that really does stand in very stark contrast to the triumphalism about democracy and the end of history that followed the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. Since 2006, both Freedom House and the Economist Intelligence Unit have recorded a decline in the aggregate global score for democracy. Between 2006 and 2015, out of the 167 countries covered by the EIU's Democracy Index, 79 registered a decline in their overall scores. And the biggest regressions have been in three regions: Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and North America. Well, actually the US, because Canada's done okay, but all the regression has been in the US. Of the 21 countries that we cover in the Democracy Index in Western Europe, 16 have suffered a regression as their aggregate scores declined between 2006 and 2015. And the US score has declined significantly over the past decade. So the contemporary problems of democracy are not just over there in Russia and the CIS, or in China, or in the Middle East, or Africa. They're very much here in the West, in the heart of the mature democracies of Western Europe and the US. So what are the symptoms? What are the manifestations of this crisis? In Europe and the US, there's been a long-term secular trend of declining trust in political institutions and elites. I think Richard will talk more about that. There's been weakness in functioning of government. There's been increased political abstention, curbs on civil liberties, especially freedom of speech. And I think today, this is the most important thing. This crisis of democracy is expressed in a failing traditional political party system, in the growing gap between elites and electorates, and a backlash against the political status quo. There's also been a shocking decline in levels of support for democracy as a system of government, especially among younger generations, and a rise in support for authoritarian alternatives such as military rule, or non-democratic alternatives such as rule by experts. That's come out of the World Values Survey in the US. There's been quite a lot written about that recently. A quarter of Americans born between 1977 and 2000 considered democracy a poor way to run a country, and almost half would approve a military takeover in the event of perceived democratic incompetence. 26% say it's unimportant for people to choose their leaders in a free election. And there's other indications of that growing cynicism about the workings of democracy, both in the US, particularly in the US, but also in Europe. So there may be a consensus about democracy being in difficulty. There's less of a consensus, I would say, about the causes and even less what to do about it. Several explanations are advanced. I don't think that they really hold up or give a full explanation of why this is happening and why it's happening now. The dominant explanation blames the economic and financial crash of 2008-2009 and the prolonged crisis that followed, which resulted in huge GDP contractions in some countries, growing unemployment, inequality and poverty. And that prolonged period of austerity and social dislocation has undermined the legitimacy of political elites and institutions in Europe and the US. Another related explanation is that globalization in all its forms has created social, regional, generational and class divides and led to a large pool of people who feel they've been left behind and not benefited. I think there's quite a lot of merit to these arguments. I wouldn't underestimate the economic toll taken by the crisis, but I don't think they provide a convincing explanation of this all-pervasive crisis of democracy in Europe and the US. I think they actually miss the main driver of popular discontent with democracy, which is political rather than economic or structural. And a few points about that. First of all, this disappointment, disenchantment with democracy that we've been picking up in our surveys, and Freedom House has, who preceded the 2008-2009 crisis. It was evident before that. Secondly, populist movements which have come to the fore in Europe in recent years, they've come to prominence in rich and poor countries, in countries that suffered badly from the fallout from the recession, and others that did relatively well in Scandinavia and Germany, for example. So economic issues are not often at the forefront of populist concerns. Issues of culture, identity, tradition, values dominate the populist discourse and resonate with their supporters. Now, so where, you remember that slogan, it's the economy, stupid. I don't really want to say it's just the politics stupid, but now we're being told that education, or the lack of it, is one of the main drivers of populism, the Brexit vote, the rise of Donald Trump. I would say the new divide is not between education and ignorance. It's a clash between one worldview and another. And I want to talk about where that comes from, because I think we really do have to get to the bottom of what is really going on and be honest about it if we want to come up with some solutions. I would say that the roots of this backlash against the democratic elite, the political elite, the growth of populist parties lie much deeper than a purely economic account would suggest. They lie in the exhaustion of the traditional mainstream political parties in Europe and the US, and the ever-growing gap between them, the political class, and the people. And I think that erosion of this post-war political order began quite a long time ago. It began in the 1970s as the post-war boom came to an end. It accelerated in the 1980s and 1990s. So by the turn of the century, by 2000, the political system and the parties that represented it bore very little relation to their forebears of the 1950s and 1960s. And it's this rupturing of the relationship between the post-war political parties and their traditional support base, especially, but not exclusively, that between the Social Democratic and Labour and Communist parties and their working class supporters. That is really what is behind all this. And as these parties have lost touch with their former social constituencies, political parties have moved closer to the state. They've moved closer to the centre ground to try and widen their support base, and they've become increasingly capital-centric or Brussels-centric. And gradually, the worldview of political parties, political elites, began to develop in counter-distinction to and in opposition to that of the voters they'd increasingly neglected, forgotten about, and left behind. And here we get to the heart of the problem, I think. In 2011, the Irish academic and political scientist Peter Mair talked in his book Ruling the Void about the hollowing out of democracy. He said that we're living in a post-popular or non-sovereign version of democracy, and that parties and governments in the West are now incapable of sustaining democracy in its current form. We've got a second-rate, downgraded democracy without its essential popular component, the demos. So that's what populism is really all about. In Europe, in the US, the political class increasingly seems to be standing in opposition to large sections of the demos. And the populists in Europe, those supporting Donald Trump, are channeling this disaffection from sections of society, often working class and blue collar, that have lost faith in the mainstream parties. They are filling a vacuum and mobilizing people on the basis of a populist, anti-elite message, and they're appealing to people's hankering to be heard, to be represented, to have their views taken seriously. So I don't think it's likely to dissipate or go away, even if Mr. Trump loses the US presidential election in a few days' time. The political backlash that fueled his insurgency would grow under a Clinton presidency, I think with extremely damaging consequences for the Republican and Democratic parties, which are already suffering serious identity and institutional crisis. And similarly in Europe, the political fragmentation we're seeing is going to carry on. Just to draw to a conclusion, I would say that the good thing about the populists is that they've mobilized people to become engaged in the political process, to vote. They've opened up the debate about big questions that have been ignored by mainstream parties. Now, of course, some people have drawn the opposite conclusion, that it isn't good, and that in the face of the Brexit vote, the rise of Trump, and so on, that democracy doesn't work anymore, that it's wrong to trust ordinary people to make sensible decisions about politics. Andrew Sullivan in New York Magazine said that democracies end when they become too democratic. The criticism that democracy has become too direct, too popular, and thus too democratic is a common response to the populist insurgency, but it's the exclusion of the people from the practice of democracy that is responsible for the present crisis and for the populist revolt. So the answer is not less democracy, but more democracy.
Thank you very much.